Okay, good. So thank you, Martin. Yes, I'm Floris at University of Montreal, and it's my pleasure today to welcome you all to this session. I see there's lots of us online, so beautiful. Thank you for being here. And I would like to warmly welcome Gina Cormier to speak here in this session. I love your background. It gives this like whole New England vibe. Beautiful. So Gina completed her bachelor degree in psychology at Concordia University, and she's currently doing a master's degree in counseling psychology with Martin Drapeau. And she is a research coordinator for a study that investigates student and campus expression across Canada. So maybe she's going to tell us about that today. And her research interests include moral psychology, psychological correlates of ideological openness, and improving access to psychological services. So with that, thank you very much for being here, Gina. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Floris. I'm just going to share my screen and show you a bit about my research. And I will hit play. So can everyone see the presentation? Yes, okay. Thanks for that lovely introduction, Floris. As you were saying, my name is Gina. I just got into my PhD, so I'm doing my PhD at McGill in counseling psychology. I'm also the student representative for the HxA, the Heterodox Academy Campus Community at McGill. And I'm going to talk to you today about open-mindedness. That's one of my research interests. It's going to be through the lens of personality psychology. So I'm interested in this topic for a variety of reasons. It's actually quite ironic because in a lot of ways, I'm not myself very open-minded. In many ways that I am open-minded, but one way I'm not that open-minded is my lack of tolerance for uncertainty. So you may relate to this if you're the type of person who likes to stick to a routine and is maybe a bit anxious and kind of takes comfort in being organized, stuff like that. In preparing my slides for this presentation, we actually suffered a huge ice storm in Montreal and we lost electricity and internet for almost a week. So that threw me off quite a bit, this unpredicted disruption, and just added to this irony of my writing a presentation on this topic of being open-minded. Because as we'll see, as open-mindedness, it involves a degree of comfort in uncertainty. So I'm going to get started and I'll explain why I would be interested in studying this, what has been referred to by some as the ethical limits of open-mindedness. Okay, so here are some societal problems that my colleagues and I have found interesting. So we've seen some attacks on science as no longer credible or true. So there are a lot of problems with how scientific data is published, but it's still one of the best ways that we have to getting close to truth on complicated topics. When there is an issue of morality, however, when our core beliefs are at stake, for example, questions during the coronavirus, where did it originate, etc., or any number of examples that speak to your worldview or ideas about what's true and false, what's right and wrong. Scientific data has been called into question in these cases, as we've seen in recent years in a variety of contexts. How about the publishing of false information, so fake news online? Or on TV, a term of course coined by former President Donald Trump of the United States to refer to false or misleading information presented as news. So we've seen this happen about recent political issues and public health issues, but in what kind of a society can fake news thrive? There needs to be people who read it and believe it, which is an interesting point, right? So we have this influx of a variety of sources that we can read when it comes to news, science. Some of it seems more credible, some of it less credible. It can become harder to see what's true, what's not true. And at the same time, we're also seeing people seem to have this susceptibility to identify with one ideology or the other. So we notice there's what seems to be this increase in polarization, radicalization, and some violent acts even. We did a study, as Flores mentioned, on student censorship on campus, and part of the results showed just how different the political beliefs were in universities compared to the general population. That's just one small example of divisions, right? But we've seen more extreme examples, for example, in the United States that I won't go into at this time. But so as I alluded to above, there are many sources of choices where to get information. So my colleagues and I have been thinking about all of this. And of course, these are a lot of complex problems with many potential reasons and solutions. But one question that we've been asking has been, how is this related to psychology and to this niche topic of personality psychology, open-mindedness, including, of course, a lack of open-mindedness? So with all of these questions, we kind of wanted to see what's out there in terms of other research. We wanted to see what has been written already about this. So we did what's called a scoping review. This just means that we gathered a bunch of articles related to this topic and read about what was correlated with open-mindedness. So we mostly read articles with themes in psychology, philosophy, and education. We wanted to understand, how does open-mindedness occur or not occur? What is it that makes it that many of us, when we hear open-mindedness, we think of this as good, but how can it also lead to something like no longer believing experts or scientific truths or media sources? How is it that we sometimes no longer believe in science or news sources? So first, a couple of points to mention before talking about these things. As the previous speakers this morning have brought up, there's a lot of overlap between psychology and between philosophy on these ethical questions of whether open-mindedness is inherently good. So I'm going to call this the virtue debate. Some researchers have said that open-mindedness is an intellectual virtue, meaning it's inherently good. It allows us to attain truth and knowledge. Many others argue that it's neutral, and it only shows its value as good when it leads to something good or is used for good purposes. So as I said, it gets pretty philosophical. There's a lot more on this, and we'll come back to it in a couple of slides. Second, I came across a lack of consistency in the language used to describe open-mindedness. So I'm going to call this construct creep. In research, we've have many names to call open-mindedness. So there's open-minded cognition, openness to experience, openness to ideas. It keeps going. And just for simplicity, I'm going to call it open-mindedness, but these all are referring to mostly the same thing, as we'll see in a moment. I might say openness or openness to ideas, open-mindedness, OM, etc. So first off, I'm going to give some case examples to help illustrate this topic. These may be a little sensitive. I made an effort here to choose examples that speak to different moral and political viewpoints here. And I want to specify that the discussion of these items isn't related to my condoning of one or the other arguments in either of these issues, but more to discuss the fact that these conversations are occurring in the public sphere, and there could be implications, whether positive or negative, to that, and they're related to open-mindedness. So first, directly from the research papers that we reviewed, this is Daryl Davis. If you haven't heard of him, I highly recommend his Wikipedia page. It's a very interesting read. He's a Black American musician, and he became friends with members of the KKK, a white supremacist hate group. And through their friendship, they eventually renounced their membership. So he helped kind of convert them so that they would leave the group. And this case has been explored in the research, actually, by Matt Furcani, a 2019 article by Matt Furcani. It's called The Moral Limits of Open-Mindedness. So he's a philosophy professor in Michigan, and he argued that being too open-minded when acting as Davis did may lead us at times to compromise on our own values to put ourselves in a dangerous situation or to have this association be used for the personal gain of the other. So in this case, KKK members, which Furcani argued occurred when a Klan member tried to use his association with Davis as a way to exempt himself when he was charged with a crime. So in this sense, Furcani argued that Davis's actions might be viewed as either a model to take after, to emulate, or as a model to avoid or reject, depending on one's perspective in terms of what's good when it comes to being open-minded, very open-minded. There's similar examples in this vein, such as an article called On the Ethics of Open-Mindedness in the Age of Trump, that also was published in 2019 by Rochelle Wall in the Scientific Literature. These bring up many questions on how good can it be to be open-minded, how when faced with social and political conflicts that could cause harm. And so next up, we have the Joe Rogan Show, the Joe Rogan Show Experience. You may have heard of it. It's quite a popular podcast. So it became much more in the news about a year ago when a doctor named Robert Malone was interviewed. And he spoke of these controversial ideas about COVID and vaccines. This information was later discredited to be untrue. And again, as mentioned, like this is a large podcast. It has 11 million listeners per show. A few weeks after this interview, the show was almost boycotted from Spotify and other streaming services as celebrities spoke out in favor of removing the show and that there should be stricter fact checking. So while many other factors come into play here, appropriateness to a context and all that, the psychology of open-mindedness does have a role here. These kinds of tensions seem to seek a middle ground. How open-minded should we be? Who is being open-minded here? And what are the implications of that? And especially when faced with people with vastly different worldviews, about as different as you can get, where do we draw that line in society? And so that leads us back to this virtue debate question: is there such a thing as being too open to ideas? Okay, so first of all, remember all those different names we had for this trait. So it turns out they're all pretty much referring to the same thing. So I'll read you some of those definitions so we start at around the same place on understanding what open-mindedness actually is. It's been defined as the disposition to engage seriously with views that are novel or that conflict with one's own, and to take appropriate action to accommodate or discard them. It's been defined as to give serious consideration to novel ideas and to revise one's beliefs in light of these ideas. My most preferred definition actually is this next one. Open-mindedness at its most basic form is the capacity to make contact with more of the complexity of the world. There's an implication in some of these definitions, a suggestion that we may need to consider revising our own beliefs in light of new ideas. We're presuming new good ideas. Again, that brings us back to this virtue question. When is it a good idea or a bad idea to revisit our own ideas? So again, there's a lot on that. Some authors have suggested that different conditions need to be met in order to call open-mindedness a virtue. So take Daryl Davis. If he believes there's a good chance of reaching the truth in the discussion, some would say that means there is a virtue to open-mindedness here. Or it's been proposed that if the discussion is taking place in a charitable manner, where both speakers give each other the benefit of the doubt, then it's good to be open-minded. So you may be thinking that's not necessarily something you'd want to do for someone in a hate group, such as the KKK, and that's absolutely valid. Maybe they wouldn't be giving you the benefit of the doubt, among other reasons. So to continue in this dialogue, if we don't feel that we're getting the benefit of the doubt, if it's not a charitable manner, and we're not reaching truth or knowledge, it's been proposed that to continue in a dialogue in that case is actually stupid, gullible, or foolhardy. This would be an example of non-virtuous open-mindedness, an example of being too open-minded. This is at least a proposition from one of the research papers we read. We'll come back to this. To make matters worse, there are many versions of open-mindedness. So we can be open-minded in a classroom, we can be open-minded at a dinner party, we can be open-minded or not in a discussion with our family, with our partner. It can depend on the context and on the person quite a bit. So if at some point this presentation gets really confusing, this is one of the reasons even researchers are confused about open-mindedness. Is it a virtue? Some say it is and some don't. The point is, we want to know if understanding open-mindedness can do something to help improve our society somehow. Okay, but on the bright side, there is at least evidence to suggest that open-mindedness is a distinct construct. This basically just means that open-mindedness is an actual thing that exists, psychologically speaking. I'll show you how we know that. In psychology, you can present a visual image of how different constructs or traits are connected. So this study looked at a personality trait called openness to experience and the many components that make up openness to experience. These components are depicted here by this image. Within these subcategories, the researchers found an area distinct to open-mindedness. You can see it here. Of course, they originally called it open-mindedness, but then decided to rename it non-traditionalism. Here it is defined as receptiveness to new ideas, cultures, and perspectives. It was found to be very close to traits of intellectual curiosity and intellectual interests, as well as variety seeking, the willingness to explore new environments and try new ways of doing things, and diversity. So that's embracing a variety of attitudes, beliefs, and lifestyles. So there is open-mindedness in terms of a definition. Now that we have a clear picture on what it is, I'd like to show you what it correlates with in terms of psychology. As mentioned, we read many articles, over 200, with the hope of gaining a better understanding of this trait, and maybe even of some of those earlier societal problems. So we asked what psychological constructs capture or are related to openness, to diversity of ideas, to free and open thinking and inquiry, and to intellectual curiosity. We used keywords such as these to find the articles about these issues. So I'm going to summarize some of the findings for you here, and I'll show you also some of the highlights. Okay, so we analyzed the article summaries of 229 scientific texts and counted how many certain traits were correlated to open-mindedness, and these 5 were listed the most often. Tolerance. So for someone who can be a bit anxious like myself, and this can be a problem for many people, tolerating ambiguity or uncertainty can sometimes be stressful or anxiety-provoking. But these are elements of tolerance here. So this also includes political tolerance. I'm not sure if we can really talk about our society as very politically tolerant at the moment. We have a chance to practice tolerance when we realize our own limits to something, when we're faced with unknowns. So whether these unknowns are related to information, to another individual, to a situation, to the future, or about an issue or an idea, it can be very hard to stop ourselves from becoming closed-minded and intolerant. Tolerant individuals, though, would find it less difficult and would respond in a more positive, accepting way when faced with this kind of uncertainty. Next up, we have empathy. So there were mixed findings about empathy and open-mindedness. Basically, there's something called hot empathy and there's something called cool empathy. That's affective versus cognitive empathy. One is more related to emotions and the other is more related to thinking. Some researchers believe that this hot empathy, this hot version, can actually detract from open-mindedness. So here you can picture a person who really feels the suffering of someone else. We say that empathy is being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. With hot empathy, you can imagine you're not just putting yourself in the other shoes for a moment, but like wearing them all day, and it's something called emotional contagion. With cool empathy, you can picture someone who really does just put themselves in the other person's shoes for a moment, but still keeps that sense of perspective. It doesn't include that level of emotional contagion. So technically, cool empathy is made up of empathic concern combined with perspective taking. And from the research, it looks as though cool empathy is more related to open-mindedness. It's got this perspective taking element to it. And perspective taking, you can picture someone who in a discussion is able to set aside their own beliefs for a moment, temporarily, to hold off on making a judgment about the other person. That's perspective taking. Then we have openness to experience. This is, once again, a big 5 personality trait. Just think of someone with a big imagination, a more creative person, maybe, someone who appreciates art and engaging with ideas. And cognitive flexibility. This is basically being able to switch between different ideas easily. You can switch perspectives and you can have many different approaches to the same problem, and maybe recognize lots of possible connections between ideas. And probably someone with a very high verbal IQ would have high cognitive flexibility. Notably, cognitive flexibility tends to go down in moments of stress and crisis. Also worth mentioning within cognitive flexibility is that there are these thinking styles. So we're calling them need for closure and need for cognition. Very interesting and very related to open-mindedness, especially need for closure. This is actually quite relevant to closed-mindedness. So need for closure is the tendency to freeze on an ideological position and to avoid alternatives. So you probably know someone who has a high need for closure. Just picture someone who can't stand uncertainty. It's actually been correlated in the literature to relate to someone who has a high need for closure tends to resort to stereotyping more frequently, can even prefer homogenous groups, is maybe higher in conformity, and less supportive of an egalitarian discussion. That brings us nicely into dogmatism. Dogmatism is basically the opposite of all of these traits. It's been most often referenced as the opposite of open-mindedness, or the closest to closed-mindedness here. I have a feeling you know dogmatic people too. People who are dogmatic tend to have a hard time believing that they could be wrong about something. They tend to believe they're always right. They're not open to change, etc. We often have this, we might think of a stereotype here of a far-right conservative. Research has shown actually that people on both ends of the political spectrum, particularly at the more extreme ends, probably have more in common in terms of how they process information than they would with more politically centrist individuals. So at the risk of oversimplifying this, just to illustrate what I'm saying here, say we have a neo-Nazi and then we also have a militant anti-fascist. Both at some point may be more likely to resort to interpersonal authoritarianism, or have lower empathy, lower perspective taking, lower cognitive flexibility in terms of the way they're processing information. So more than others, people on radical sides politically may seek to satisfy a need to be certain about something and to reduce existential threat. People who are highly dogmatic tend to have a fear of threat or loss. They are less tolerant of uncertainty or system instability. They have a higher need to achieve order, structure, and closure. As you can imagine, this can lead a person to become rigid in their thinking, reluctant to seek out contradictory information. A lot of traits related to need for closure, need to settle on one idea at the expense of all others. Okay, so apart from those constructs that are related themselves to open-mindedness, there were some really fascinating theories discussed in the articles on open-mindedness in itself. So I'm going to walk you through 2 to 3 of the highlights and how they propose to respond to this debate of when is it no longer ethically sound to exercise open-mindedness. Okay, this was something we came across called the triadic theory. It was offered as a potential response to this virtue debate question. It suggests that open-mindedness is to be considered an intellectual virtue, but one that's multifaceted. I'll explain. Back in 2009, a philosopher named Chris Higgins proposed this theory in response to many other scholars. You know, these other scholars had essentially argued that, to put it simply, open-mindedness is not a virtue. It doesn't capture, to say that it's a virtue doesn't capture it. It's not always good, you know, being open-minded to the wrong thing at the wrong time is not open-mindedness, etc. Chris Higgins proposed this as a response. It's actually based on the work of Aristotle, the great philosopher. Aristotle had something called the golden mean, or the theory of the mean. The theory of the mean states that anything that is a virtue must have opposite pairs, one of deficiency and one of excess. So the most common example that's given with this is bravery. So you can think of the deficiency of bravery as cowardice and the excess of bravery as arrogance or recklessness. Here, Higgins proposed that open-mindedness is the middle, the mean, and that's in the center. But it has, for example, deficiency of dogmatism, rigidity, hastiness, and as an excess, it has traits of indecisiveness, spinelessness, gullibility, etc. So this is one theory that struck us as quite interesting. And I've been looking at it for several months. The longer I look at it, it seems to strike me as 2 sides of the same coin. Kind of like with political radicalism, we saw that the extreme ends seem to be more related than we might think. I'll give you an example of what I mean here. Maybe this is from my own experience in being closed-minded, but picture you have a question about a controversial topic. You have many potential solutions. On the internet, in the mainstream news, people you talk to all have different opinions. Let's say you started out a bit indecisive about the problem down here. You were maybe even a bit gullible about all these possible solutions or explanations. So let's say there's a bit of emotional overwhelm, informational overwhelm happening, and you get fed up with all this information coming in from all these different sources. You want to make a quick choice. This could turn to hastiness as you try to remove the complexity of all these possibilities. So once you get to that point, kind of throw up your hands and say, I'm just going to choose something to believe here. You end up on this other side, the deficient side. You might even get kind of rigid in the decision. Oh, like this is what I believe now. You know, this is the news source I've chosen, or this is what I think is true. Because if we decide that we're certain about something beyond the shadow of a doubt, then we can avoid slipping back into what might be an uncomfortable state of indecision again, and avoiding the sense of chaos or messy mind that we see down here. Of course, you don't want to look like you're spineless either, like you don't know what you stand for, right? So avoiding these things on the bottom may push some to become more like these traits on the top, is what I'm saying. maybe even having some suspiciousness about other truths or other explanations. You may become dogmatic about your choice being the right answer, out of fear for being pivoted back to the other end. So again, this reminds me of the need for closure and that trait cognitive flexibility that we saw earlier. It's basically suggesting that anxiety or intolerance about uncertainty could lead to either indecision or rigidity. So either deficient or excess openness to new ideas. We're going to talk more about that. So what I found even more interesting is how this could impact identity. So as I like to say, when you decide to be open-minded to a new idea that goes against or contradicts your own idea, you kind of have to let go of a part of yourself, maybe the part that believed in this contrary opinion. So if open-mindedness were represented by this image as Chris Higgins proposed, depending where you might be situated in this diagram, letting go of your own idea might be easy or it might be difficult. Because as we see, one of the excess sides of open-mindedness here is self-abasement. So for someone closer to this side, letting go would be very easy. I'll give you an anecdote to try to illustrate how this is related to identity. I was at a conference recently speaking to someone who has done his doctorate in philosophy. And we were discussing the golden mean theory by Aristotle, this theory of the mean. And he said that the mean is relative to us. So the mean is relative to you. This is the mean in the center here. So basically, ideal open-mindedness depends on us as individuals. It depends on who we're talking about, on their identity, on their tendencies, on their ability to be highly closed or highly open. You can think of Daryl Davis here. For some people, what he did maybe seems insurmountable or impossible, to the point that the philosophy scholar was questioning the ethics of this. But for him, it works because the mean, the open-mindedness ideal in the center here depends on us. It's relative to us. Speaking about identity, though, and researching open-mindedness, we came across the work of developmental psychologists Erik Erikson and James Marchia, who studied youth development, youth moral development. They're well known in psychology, and they have these developmental stages called identity foreclosure and identity diffusion. They had similarities. We just noticed this, that there were these similarities between these identity stages like foreclosure with this deficient end of open-mindedness. And there were similarities with this identity stage of diffusion and the excess of open-mindedness. So at least in the developmental sense, such as in childhood, adolescence, and youth, it made us wonder whether there's maybe some objective standard or ideal of open-mindedness, that a clearer measure of when is too much versus too little, or does it completely depend on the individual? If you're feeling kind of lost with this, I'm going to try to draw it for you here, just a second. So let's say we have a line. I think you can see my drawing. And on one end, we have self-abasement here. On the other end, that's my SA. On the other end, we have arrogance. And in the center is open-mindedness. The further you get from self-abasement, the closer you get to open-mindedness. And the further you get towards arrogance, the further you get away from open-mindedness. I hope that helps explain it a bit. But it's kind of that idea that the closer you get to one side, the farther you are from open-mindedness. Okay, so speaking about this research to people, this is the question I get the most often. What does excess open-mindedness even mean? How can you have too much of a good thing? So I'd like to talk about what that might look like a bit. So keep in mind that some of these traits of excess open-mindedness here on the right, those arguing that it's not always good are saying that being too open-minded can lead to taking unnecessary risks, calling into question our own beliefs, acquiring false beliefs, or just discarding true beliefs. So some case examples, potential case examples. Conspiracy theories. There's the QAnon group, which is a group of people who believed in fabricated claims made online by an anonymous individual. And then Alex Jones, a host of the biggest conspiracy theory show in the US. He lost in court for defamation last year and was ordered to pay over $900 million, if you remember, for saying that the Sandy Hook school shootings didn't actually happen. But to give you an idea of what $900 million is, he has a revenue of 60 to 70 million per year. So that gives you an idea of how many followers this man has. Some might consider this as a form of being too open-minded or too gullible to false ideas. Or on the other side, is this simply about being dogmatic towards what we already believe to be true? But how did we get to believe it in the first place? So again, it seems like they're two sides of the same coin. Next, we have another example, cults. So I don't know how to pronounce this cult name. It's also known as the Bronfman sex cult, or NXIVM. It recruited based on multi-level marketing and a curriculum that was called rational inquiry. Then we have religions like Scientology, where you have to pay to achieve the next level of knowledge. So we're wondering, are these groups preying on people who have a tendency to relate to this excess openness? I actually discovered through this research that in Montreal here, we have an organization called InfoSect. It actually helps people get out of cults. So for those who were too highly involved in cults, fascinating. Then, of course, don't mean to associate these necessarily. I'm just saying that they could be another area where we wondered about excess openness is psychological disorders. So when things get really difficult, when we get anxious or depressed or develop a psychological disorder, it's undeniable that our thinking is affected. Again, I'm not saying that's necessarily the case for cult or conspiracy theory. It's just another example of excess openness. You know, if you're prone to feeling depressed, you might think everyone hates me, or a form of biased thinking. This is a bias, a thinking trap, you could call it. And we might all do this a little bit. So these tendencies are present on a continuum. But some of these ways of coping take place more when a person is stressed out or during a crisis. Different individuals express these thinking biases in more extreme ways than others. So what do I mean by different biases and distortions and ways of coping? So we have something called a jumping to conclusions bias. This is having a tendency to jump to quick conclusions, and that's been associated with some disorders. I highlighted here splitting or disavowal. This is a way that people cope psychologically with uncomfortable information, and I will talk more about it in a couple of slides. Okay, so let's talk a bit about processes now. How does open-mindedness occur in the mind? Or more, how does closed-mindedness happen? Because we'll look more a little bit at closed-mindedness. There are some theories on this, and there are two prominent explanations. So one, it says open-mindedness occurs when someone confronts an unfamiliar idea and decides to reject it or consider it. So this is a vetting process, sort of a rationalization, a deliberation. What's true, what's not true. This is kind of on the surface. This is not addressing a deeper question. In this, there's something deeper besides this explanation. So that's why we have explanation 2, which says open-mindedness occurs when our schemas of awareness allow us to notice an idea. This explanation is about perception. It's about whether we allow in a new idea or does it remain invisible. So for our purposes, I'm going to focus on explanation 2. It's the more interesting one when it comes to being closed or open-minded. Okay, this gets a bit philosophical, so just stick with me. We all have schemas, kind of like codes that help us understand the world. So for example, a child sees cars going by in the street and begins to understand the concept of roads and motor vehicles. They now have a transportation schema. Let's say that the child then sees a fire truck for the first time. And there's a mix of shock and excitement and maybe even some fear, depending on the kid. And now a fire truck is added to this schema through the senses of perception. Of course, this gets more complicated when this idea is abstract, like a political belief. Once we perceive the idea, we might accept it. We might integrate it into our schema of the world, or we might reject it. So kind of like the kid seeing a fire truck for the first time and not really believing it at first. This is basically how learning occurs in some sense. It's this exposure to new ideas. And when we haven't seen something existing yet, it's hard to even recognize it, right? This gets really interesting if the new idea makes us uncomfortable or if we dislike the new idea. So I'm going to use a more abstract example. Let's say someone says we should build a wall between our country and another country, like a border wall. If this idea goes completely against anything that we would ever consider realistic, it's not possible. This new idea maybe wouldn't even enter in our awareness. It would go in one ear and out the other. And as quickly as it's proposed, we would just dismiss it. Because our schema of the world, maybe about our country and what's possible in our country, has narrowed our focus to the fact that this is being proposed. We skip right over it, kind of brush it off. It's not going to happen. That's one way of being closed to an idea. Of course, I'm not saying we should be open to the idea of a border wall. I'm just using it as an example to illustrate this process. Stick with me here. If the new idea does enter our awareness in a way that we're able to consider it meaningfully, then there's this more obvious confrontation with something new, something different. So let's say in this example, you now learn that your country has decided to build this wall and that this is now going to happen. It's an idea you're being now forced to integrate because it's going to happen. You're surprised, what's going on? There's a discrepancy between what you believe and imagine about your country and what you're observing or seeing. This usually results in some kind of disappointment of expectations or assumptions. Maybe you believed your country was more open and welcoming and would never just decide to build this wall. And this changes everything. It challenges our concepts of what it means to live here. We're forced to redefine our beliefs about our own country, etc. The point is, you realize that your previous schema was limited or flawed, and that can be really uncomfortable and challenging. When we notice a limitation in our understanding, that's a place when closed-mindedness can occur, because this is kind of why open-mindedness is so difficult. It can be distressing for people to realize that they were wrong about something that's kind of fundamental to identity, such as our country, for example. It could be a lot more comfortable to just pretend that this isn't really happening, right? Let's just pretend that the wall is not happening. The nice thing here, well, it's maybe thanks to evolution, is that we can pretend that this wall isn't happening. In our minds, we can sort of play a trick, and in these moments of distress, there are these coping mechanisms, again, that come up to avoid the discomfort of the disliked and challenging idea. We can use any number of psychological defenses. So this is how closed-mindedness can also occur, even once something has been perceived. So despite being faced with the truth, here, this border wall, we can refuse to believe it. We can push it out of our conscious awareness even. So in this sense, being open-minded requires being comfortable with what is sometimes a distressing sense of uncertainty or disbelief. We may be capable of integrating a new idea, but even at this unconscious level, we want to keep that idea far away as possible, because it's associated with discomfort. So what does that look like when we're coping in that way? For example, through splitting. This is one of the psychological coping we have to uncomfortable information. Think about when you have a fight with your spouse or a family member, and suddenly you feel like they're the enemy and nothing they say is right, and how could they ever be right, and they're a villain. Multiply that by 10 or 100, and you're getting close to what we're dealing with splitting. It's a less obvious form of closed-mindedness in that it's this response to becoming aware by an idea, but in a negative way, in a way that makes you uncomfortable. So you seek to avoid it. It's kind of like black and white thinking or dichotomous thinking, splitting. You can do this through devaluing the person who is saying the idea. So reducing their value, saying to yourself, oh, they're just stupid, you know, or you can split that idea out of your own conscious mind even. We all do this to some extent in our everyday life. And when we're not feeling well, these things exacerbate, they get worse. Splitting is unconscious. People rarely know why they're splitting. There's just an uncomfortable mix of emotions and some anxiety that leads them to feel the need to split off that information and kind of bury it somewhere. It's driven by anxiety about complexity. Okay, and so issues of improving social justice can be very complex. It can be very, very tempting to simplify this complexity through splitting. It can be also a response to distress about contradiction. Think of a very polarized discussion, and there's a palpable tension in the room, and the stress increases, and it impacts our ability to listen. We start to think dichotomously, that we're right, they're wrong. And from here, it's just a small step to devaluing others. They're stupid, they can't think straight, they're evil, even whether they're woke, Antifa, or racist and transphobic. So in this way, splitting makes us see people as all good or all bad. It helps us to demonize others and fuels this sense that we've got it right. When a matter becomes personal, so whether you're a John Stuart Mill fan and you're fighting really aggressively for academic freedom, or you're an anti-racist activist who's really angry at injustice, if something gets personal, it's really hard to get through to anyone when we fall into a thinking trap like splitting. It can reduce the complexity of nuances and conflicts, and it can make the world seem simple and more coherent and more stable. This brings us back to our definition of open-mindedness as the ability to perceive more of the complexity in the world. If that complexity at some point overwhelms either our cognitive or psychological capacity in the moment, a process like splitting might occur and might appear to be the most viable option even. Of course, things are a little more complex than this, but for the sake of time, I'm simplifying this. Okay, one last theory on this stuff. There are kind of two forms or versions of open-mindedness. There was this study we looked at on open-minded cognition, and it measured levels of open-mindedness in a political or a religious discussion and found that those were different than people's open-mindedness in a general sense. So it helps us with this theory of there being both a state of open-mindedness as well as a trait. So the state is more subject to change. It's a temporary state, you know, it's occurring. Maybe the person is going through a developmental stage, maybe their ideas are being challenged or they're in a crisis. And so based on the readings, some factors that might affect the state of open-mindedness could be social pressure, so a need for belonging, a need for safety, a need to be well esteemed, and also moral identity. Depending if a person is in the process of developing their identity, their beliefs, or if those beliefs are being challenged or are in a crisis. This can impact the state of open-mindedness in the moment. Or if we don't know what we believe yet about something, that could affect the state of open-mindedness. Also, our self-concept in a similar vein. Self-concept can affect state levels of open-mindedness, as we saw with the earlier slide on self-abasement. It's been found that someone with a less strong sense of self, or a sense of self in development, would be more susceptible to forming new beliefs, suggesting again a greater state of open-mindedness. And then we have the more stable trait, or the disposition, which is more chronic, permanent disposition a person has, maybe in an everyday situation, not in a crisis. The person is taking in new information at the rate they normally would, and you may be more equipped to perceive complexity with this trait of open-mindedness. So some factors that might affect the trait could be upbringing. So this is the degree and frequency of exposure to new or different ideas. So how much does a person have a role model of tolerance for uncertainty, or is it okay to not know the answers? Is that tolerated? Genetics. So traits such as anxiety, neuroticism, and even openness to experience have been reported to have biological or hereditary components. So that can also influence the trait level. And then values, deeply held beliefs, what we have ingrained in our mind over time as true, whether that's cultural, social, or even political exposure, that can impact our overall disposition to be more open or closed to new ideas. Oh yeah, values, there it is. Okay, so to wrap it up, there's a lot more that we still need to know about all of this. Psychology and philosophy and education researchers have been puzzling over these questions about the ethics of open-mindedness for decades, if not much longer. We're still figuring it out. What do we need to figure out? Well, we could figure out ways to measure if there really are deficient and excess levels of openness, or if it's all relative to the individual. If we could measure some aspect of that, we might be able to gain more understanding of what's happening with societal polarization, or even with the reasons that people choose to join a cult or a hate group. Not to condone this behavior, of course, it's just very important to understand this, because there tends to be these kind of ideological tribes right now, right? So it would be important to understand this. And if we could figure that out, we could maybe see who's at risk, and psychologists would be better equipped to intervene. Also, we need to figure out, as one of our Professor Kalev mentioned earlier, whether our policies of equity, diversity, and inclusion are attaining the true aims for societal improvement that we hope to achieve. If not, we need to have a sober look at how we can improve our chances of reaching objectives on social justice by using more carefully thought out or deliberate methods with scientific evidence to show that they work. So again, I will refer you to the book of Professor Kalev, who spoke this morning, Diversity, What Works, What Doesn't. I think it was called something like that. And again, I wrote here, openness is not always equal to openness, because the reason I put that is that these coping strategies that we do, these psychological coping strategies, with that, it's possible for us to seem open, but in practice and in consequence, for it something to be completely different. Even if it looks like openness on the outside, it may not be that the person is that open. And finally, we need to figure out how to improve open-mindedness. So what struck us as surprising in the articles that we read it actually was difficult to come across any consensus on how this can happen, how to improve open-mindedness. Actual interventions for improving open-mindedness were just like islands in an ocean of theories and speculation and qualitative narratives. We did see a mixed variety of unique approaches scattered here and there, but there was no really definitive answer to this very important question. We did see, of course, that open-mindedness is correlated with tolerance, empathy, openness to experience, and cognitive flexibility. So that being said, we need to focus on these traits and how to improve them if we want to improve open-mindedness, and perhaps with a special focus on certain forms of empathy. I would also add that we need to be especially tolerant towards uncertainty and even to ideas that seem to be threatening or destabilizing to us. As Chris Higgins, who proposed the triadic theory, wrote, we all actively shrink the world into manageable levels of complexity, and open-mindedness goes beyond fairness to conflicting ideas. It means we have to be comfortable with greater complexity and sensitive to what we may have left out in our initial noticing of a situation or an issue. So after reflecting on all of this for a while with a team of researchers at McGill and University of Montreal, I'd like to propose a few more potential answers and concluding thoughts. It's clear that when confronted with differences and uncertainty, we don't all respond the same. We have psychological states and processes that can impact our receptivity to hearing other points of view. In some contexts, like threats and in a crisis, when we feel threatened, it can be very tempting also to become aggressive, to blame other people or groups of people. This is a form of devaluing others. Devaluing might start with labeling, with name calling, and it can justify all sorts of actions, as we've seen many terrible examples throughout the 20th century. It's a path towards dehumanization once we start to devalue someone. And yet I've seen this happen, at least in a very small way, like a preview of this, even in the classroom and on campus. So we're quick to jump to label someone and conclude that they're on the wrong side politically or morally, just for asking critical questions or uncomfortable questions. So while it may be important to have a universal standard on what's right and wrong, what's too open and too closed-minded. Maybe for like a professional world example, I don't know if we should be firing Karen in accounting because we don't like her bumper sticker or because something she said during a meeting was offensive. We don't want this to go to the point where we can't have a discussion anymore. Finally, also, we're faced with this abundance of information. There's an overwhelming amount of choices or complexity. It can be tempting to resort to splitting, to jumping to conclusions in order to make quick choices about what's true. So again, I think that we really need to focus on improving tolerance for uncertainty to improve open-mindedness and being able to recognize when we're resorting to coping with this uncertainty and complexity in a way that's not helpful to ourselves or others. And seeking ways to keep connecting with others that can keep the dialogue going, even when it gets really difficult for us. Yeah, so to avoid the reflex of labeling and devaluing. And this is especially important on campuses and in departments like psychology, where so much of what we do and the whole profession really is based on words and on connecting with people. So on that note, I'd like to thank you very much for your kind attention, and a big thank you to the team who worked with me on all of this information. And if you'd like to stay in touch with any activities related to this conference and to our campus communities group at McGill, feel free to send me an email and I'll add you to our mailing list. And please do let me know if you have some questions, suggestions, comments, or critiques. I will do my best to be open-minded.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gina, for that talk. I'd love to open the floor for questions. So for those attending, please put your questions in the Q&A box. That should be on the bottom of your screen. There should be a button Q&A where you can submit your questions. And there's already a few of them coming in. So Gina, if you're ready, we'll shoot the first one. This is a question from Mark Clench. I hope I pronounced it correctly. Mark asks, have you noticed if there is a direct correlation between people high in open-mindedness and issues with anxiety or depression?
Yeah, great question, Mark. Well, what we have noticed on that is people with anxiety and depression tend to be more likely than others to fall into cognitive, what we call a thinking trap. So such as the jumping to conclusion or need for closure, those kinds of things. That is one thing that we've noticed. And so we do propose at this point that anxiety has a moderating effect on the open-mindedness and closed-mindedness due to that, because there is this relation with using sort of thinking traps or cognitive distortions to explain the world. So for example, like we had said in the presentation with someone who is depressed might jump to the conclusion, everyone hates me, right? And that's in a sense, that's a response to something intolerable, like it may be an intolerable feeling or uncertainty, but it is a biased thinking. It's still a biased thinking. And so, yes, in that sense, it's undeniable that our thinking is affected by when these disorders, when we have an anxiety disorder or a depression, yes, our thinking is affected, and that can have an effect on how open or closed-minded we are.
Beautiful, thank you. We have another question from Adam Burnett. Adam asks, are need for closure and need for cognition anti-correlated?
Oh, if they're anti-correlated, I would assume yes. I don't know exactly for sure, but need for cognition is sort of the opposite. Yeah, in the literature, when we see need for closure, it's the one that's more related to closed-mindedness, whereas from my understanding, at least, the need for cognition was more related to need to understand a situation. So you're willing to look for more explanations. And so it's not necessarily being as closed as the need for closure. I don't know if they were like anti-correlated or negatively correlated, but I would assume they're similar, like to opposites. They're kind of like opposite, yeah. But I'm not absolutely sure on that. Good question, though.
We have a question from an anonymous attendee. Can you speculate more about how to apply these research insights to encourage open-mindedness, or at least motion towards an individual golden mean as a virtue? Because it seems like training, in quotes, could lead to a backlash along the lines of Dr. Caleb's insights into DEI training versus more practical / impactful interventions.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's definitely where we're heading next. I'm hoping to do my PhD on this same topic and explore more of these practical interventions that can demonstrate how to be more open-minded. One way we're thinking is just to be able to measure and I love how you referenced the golden mean theory. You know, it's reassuring that this was understandable, because it's kind of vague when you present it. But in this theory, we would like to be able to measure if somebody falls on the deficient or the excess level of this spectrum, because essentially that could increase our self-awareness. If there were to be some kind of objective measure of that we could become more self-aware. Oh, I actually am showing up on this quiz as like deficient or excessive in my openness level, you know. But that's a big question, like whether is it just related to the individual, or is there any way to put an objective measure on it? We're kind of looking into that, but I very much appreciate the point that, you know, we need to have more practical applications. And that was one lack we saw in the literature. There weren't enough, like there were different things proposed, as I mentioned, here and there, but no really consensus on what improves open-mindedness. So that's where we're headed next.
Cool. Yeah, just to following up on that, I was wondering, and maybe this is in the question too, if open-mindedness lies on this continuum, and the optimum for whatever, according to whatever metric of optimality we have, the optimum will be somewhere in the middle, then if you have an intervention that increases open-mindedness, you would actually risk sort of putting people who are, let's say, already in the middle, or like on the too much side of the spectrum, for them to actually experience adverse effects of your training. Can you comment on that? Like, is that something you worry about, and how do you see that being taken into account?
Absolutely. Yeah, great point. Well, I just think of it, I guess, in a different way, in the sense that when I think now, because of looking at that diagram, when I think now of improving open-mindedness, I'm not thinking of increasing it to the excess side. I'm actually just thinking improving to bring it closer to the mean, if that makes sense. You know, improving rather. So we had, for example, the arrogance versus self-abasement, right? With open-mindedness in the center. So an improving measure would actually bring someone further from both extreme. So they would be less likely to be self-abasing, and then they would be less likely to be arrogant and reckless, or whatever it is, and more likely to just be balanced. It's actually the balance of those traits that we're looking for, rather than the increase necessarily.
Okay, cool.
Great question.
So thank you. We have another question. Instead of looking at deficiency and excess of open-mindedness, isn't it a dialectic between being open and going back to closure in an ongoing process?
Yeah, I think so. Instead, yeah, I think that would be a good way to characterize it as well. Yeah, just to think of it as a dialectic. In fact, a lot of the splitting stuff comes from borderline personality disorder, which we have dialectical behavior therapy as a treatment for, because of this tendency in people with borderline to split. Not that everyone, you know, who's splitting has borderline, of course. It's just something people do a little bit of, but someone with borderline would be doing it much more often, right? And so we're treating that with this by looking at dialectics, by looking at, okay, it's possible for two opposing ideas to exist at the same time, right? So yes, I hope that answers your question, but I do think it's a good way to characterize it as well. We maybe in a less pejorative sense, because I think this deficiency and the lack and the virtue and the vice, deficiency excess talk can run the risk of sounding like pejorative or judgmental or something. But no, it's true. I do think of it as this dialectic of going between the extremes.
Cool. Yeah. Following up on that, I was curious. Are you aware of studies that show negative associations with open-mindedness? So meaning, you know, a relation between open-mindedness and something else that we know is not good. Like I think earlier we had a question about depression and anxiety, but like, could there be? You could imagine equally like problems with maybe decision making, or like, is there like actual empirical data on that that we could base ourselves on here?
Yeah, absolutely. There is. So for example, I would refer for that just directly to the Big Five personality inventory. It's called the NEO, neuroticism, extroversion, openness, right? So it's a very fundamental study, well, not study, measure that's been used in psychology for many, many years and been well validated. And this, if you read in the interpretation, for example, of someone's openness scores in this measure, if somebody scores very high in openness, there are implications there, like with what you had described just now, Flores, as like negative traits, maybe like this scatteredness. So for example, someone who has a hard time to make a decision, or, is going to easily throw out their own ideas in favor of, whoever's walking by on the street. So these do have negative, you would look into the high openness interpretation on the Big Five personality inventory, though I'm not sure that you can look for on that vein for it, but I mean, it's also unfortunately like a proprietary tool that psychologists use. So I'm not sure how much the actual interpretation is available publicly, but there's definitely relation to high openness and some kind of negative traits. Also, someone who might have is very, like they say when you're studying the neo, if someone has very, very high openness, they might be very creative and have a lot of good things going, but also they might be quicker to believe in a thinking trap or a cognitive distortion. That's why there's also this relation with depression and anxiety.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, and it sounds like it would be interesting to have like an overview of those data, like a synthetic overview of the empirical support for this idea that there might be like this not so useful side to open-mindedness.
Yeah, I agree.
Cool. Relating to this, someone in the audience is curious about how open-mindedness relates to socioeconomic factors. Are you aware of studies investigating whether maybe working class people are more or less open-mindedness relative to elites?
Actually, no, I don't think I've come across anything on that. I could try to speculate, but I haven't come across, but it would be very interesting to know. I haven't seen anything yet on it.
Okay. We have a question that is wondering, like, how does what you're researching here, open-mindedness, help to inform matters of EDI? So the topic of the conversation conference here. So do you have some things where you feel like your work could feed into what people here care about in terms of equity, diversity, inclusion, maybe especially in a context of academic freedom? Can you say some things about that?
I do think there are many relations. Whether I can articulate it that well right now, I hope so. But I tried to draw some in the presentation. But yes, a very good question. Absolutely. Like, how does it relate to EDI? And I think how it relates potentially is, again, in the backlash and in the results that when we don't get the results we're intending with an EDI initiative. So, for example, if somebody's telling us we need to do this more inclusive message or policy, and let's say that, like Professor Kalev was describing before, in the context of this intervention, like in a mandatory training you might have to go to for anti-bias, let's say the person in this training might say the mantra of inclusion, but deep down, are they splitting something? Are they really feeling that inclusive, or are they just playing the part? And that's something I think that we're looking at and that we're seeing in psychology, that people are not always as open as they appear to be, or they may be playing a part and saying this mantra just for the sake of appearing open, but in deep down, it's possible they could have some feelings of resentment for having to do this anti-bias training or whatever it is. And then how is that going to look when that resentment builds? And then, as Professor Kalev showed very well, it didn't look good in terms of greater representation in hiring. If we're pushing people to do these, mandatory trainings that we don't necessarily have this evidence for it to work, people can say they're open, but that doesn't necessarily mean they are. I think that's how it relates.
Yeah. And do you have some suggestions for like how we could address that? It sounds like you're laying your finger on an important issue that I imagine everybody here cares about. Like when we say EDI, like we want to have genuine improvements in into people's lives across the board.
Yeah.
And so when we run into trainings where people are just taught to say the mantras, but and just go through the motions, but they don't actually make any change in implementing it, like that sounds like obviously problematic. Do you have any ideas about like how we could approach that, and can maybe your research help us out here?
Okay, yeah, big question. Well, I think again, I'm going to refer back to Professor Kalev because she had some great information. But all I would say about that really is something more scientific based. Something that, as long as like, if we can know that what we're doing has been supported by research and to improve equity and also the Professor Gingras, who was speaking earlier. First of all, we need to be clear about what we're actually referring to with these things, because there's a lot of new words that are created, and there's a lack of clarity. Then there's like this tendency for that to become blurry. What do we exactly mean when we say equity or diversity or inclusivity, and what does that look like, or how can we best approach it? I think the method right now is clunky, and it's like we're figuring it out, and it's not very smooth right now. So I do have hope that maybe we're in this stage of overcorrection, and we're really trying to overcorrect these wrongs, and maybe it's going to balance out, and we're going to realize, oh, there's maybe a better way to go about this that's still going to get us what we're going for, but it's maybe like more balanced, or is actually supported with scientific evidence. Yeah, so where the research can help with that, I think, is just researching again those interventions that do increase openness to diversity, and so that we can, that's where my field lies more, is individual psychological personality levels of openness. What does increase a person's openness to diversity of thinking? And I don't think it's those mandatory trainings, but in terms of going forward, what to do, I mean, well, I guess we're going to look for those solutions, but we need to look at it with clarity and be sure we're saying what we mean to say, and that the words we're using mean what we think they mean, that they mean the same thing the other person thinks they mean, etc. Using common language.
Yeah. To like I'd love to give you some more space to like unpack that more fully. It seems to me like you're identifying with what you're just saying. You're identifying the distinction between paying lip service to an idea and actually supporting the idea. And I think in your presentation you were alluding to like a rich literature on open-mindedness that I think essentially used self-report questionnaires. And so one could say that it might be quite easy for somebody to say that they're open, or maybe especially after training, they would say, oh yeah, I'm very open, and so you'd see an increase in those measures. But like, how do we know that people actually on the ground are engaging in open-minded behaviors? Like, do we have measures of that? Can you help us out here? Or what would those look like if they don't exist?
No, absolutely. I fully agree with the self-report being problematic, and that we need more clear measures to help us understand it. And behaviorally, I think, is the most we can do in psychology for a large part, because how do we measure something in psychology? Well, we measure it through behavior. So a lot of the time, right? So I think we would need to change the measures a little bit, revisit some of them, just to not rely as much on self-report. I agree. Maybe something more behavioral, experimental. We're going to keep looking.
Cool. Perhaps related to that, we have somebody who's wondering, the question is posed in French, but I'll allow myself to translate it because I assume they'll be listening to the translation here. So this person is wondering, the person says, if we understand you correctly, you're situating open-mindedness as like somewhere on a scale between extremes. And this person's question is, what is the place of scientific reasoning in this story? Like, where would that fall? Like in terms of observation of facts, testing of hypotheses, and with the aim of finally making a decision about a particular problem. Would that count as closed-mindedness, or like how would that? Can you comment on the place of that in your thinking?
Yeah, so if I understand the question, it's kind of asking, where does science come in the sense of, do we have some objective standard of what's too open-minded, what's not open-minded enough?
No, I think it's got more, the question, the way I understand it is more about what about the scientific process? Like, would you characterize that as open-minded or closed-minded? In the sense that, once we collect some data, we test hypotheses, like where is that on this scale? Can you comment on that?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yeah. Okay, so where is the scientific process in terms of open or closed thinking? I think it's as good as the people who are doing the process in terms of their thinking. We know that when there's a morality, or when there's an issue of morality brought into a question, like what's right and wrong, people tend to hang on to what they believe, regardless of other information coming in. So if that's occurring for people who are doing the study, if their morality is somehow affected, if their beliefs are somehow at play or being called upon, then it's going to impact the scientific process. I'm not sure if I'm answering it exactly, but we know that can affect people's beliefs in what's credible, beliefs in what's true. If we have already a preset belief or an idea, a very personal idea about what's right and wrong, I think it's possible for science to have the objective truth, absolutely. I think that there is something objective that we can get from scientific study, but we just need this peer review. That's why we have this process of peer review, where we get people to review it so that other people who aren't as biased as us can look it over, right?
We have another question coming up about the social situation. They're sort of situating this in a social context, and the question here is, what's your sense of open-mindedness? Could it be like a luxury stance that like only some people who are, let's say, college educated or socioeconomically superior can afford themselves? What's your take on that?
So whether open-mindedness would be something only the educated could attain?
Yes.
No, I don't think so at all. I think, I mean, I'm going to look at how to back that up, but I think that it's something, like I said, it depends on if we look back to the trait in the slides, what determines the trait. So a person's values and upbringing, a person's even sometimes genetics, and what was the other one? I have it here. The upbringing, genetics, and values. Exactly, the values. If you're brought up with a certain, like if your parents, let's say, are saying, oh, it's okay that I didn't know the answer to that, that's already modeling this tolerance for uncertainty, this tolerance that it's okay to be wrong. So it really, really depends on a lot of things, like from an early age with people. And maybe that can answer the earlier question as well that we had about socioeconomic status. It really depends on what kind of a model you have and what kind of values those models are built on, or vice versa. That depends, that determines how open-minded you will be too. So it's not something that is only a luxury thing through education, but I'm sure education, of course, can help.
Yeah, and maybe to follow up on this question, I think what the person was also maybe wondering about is like, could like open-mindedness almost be a badge that certain people would be attracted to wear, so it would be your proof of like, getting into the rich club, or oh, to join our group you have to be open-minded, or maybe it would be like a signal of some socioeconomic superiority or so. Do you think there's the risk of that?
Yes, I think there's a risk of that. Absolutely. I like how you put it there. And I do think there's a risk of that. And in fact, it's already, I think, happening to some degree. But it's something we should be aware of in terms of studying it and measuring it. We don't want to turn it into this exclusivity thing where, if you score this level, you can now attend this class or something like that. Of course not. But I think it's important to it would be nice still to have an objective measure, because even if we don't have that objective measure, this is already happening, I think, where because we conform to groups, right? If you look at the Ash-Line study, I don't know if anyone's familiar, Ash is ASCH, Ash-Line study. It's a very good study on conformity, fundamental study. And we will say something false just because everyone in the room is saying something false, even if it goes against what we're perceiving. So that's where I'm worried about that in terms of like this openness badge idea, and the EDI stuff as well. Like we were saying with saying, we believe in this, we're open, I'm open, etc. But are you like, how do we determine that versus virtue signaling and just demonstrating that you're the most open of everyone, and that's because what everyone else is saying, so I'm going to say that. I think that's why it kind of speaks to the importance of finding this objective measure, but definitely something to keep in mind when looking for this measure.
Yeah, cool. So I'd love to like, we have a few minutes left, but I'd love to pivot briefly to the role of institutions in this matter. So we have like a few questions actually here that center around this inquiry about whether institutions can and should play a role in fostering environments in which people might be able to be more exploratory or engage more in open-minded behaviors. Do you have some sense of what this could look like, and some recommendations for, let's say, leaders in such institutions?
Great question. So I do focus more, like I said, on the individual, on the psychology aspect of it at a personal level. But that being said, I think we need to look to the research and what is demonstrating an effect, what's demonstrating a positive effect in terms of if the institution can play a positive role in increasing diversity and inclusion. I think so, yes. But we need to look at what works. We need to be sure that it works. And it's something, like we're saying, where it's very easy to fall into this trap of like, oh, they're doing this, we're going to do that, and he's saying this, I'm going to say that, so this kind of conformity and that becomes very empty ultimately, right? It becomes this act that you're playing, like, okay, we have to meet this quota, and so we're going to do our due diligence and meet this quota, but that's not addressing the real issue. I think we need to be sure that if we're going to try to address something as an institution, we're not just doing this lip service, like we're saying here. We're looking at what is the real issue, for example, with representation, Indigenous representation and Black representation in universities. Are we giving Indigenous students and Black students opportunities at a really young age to get into these institutions, or are we just throwing money at the grant level, at the doctorate level, and saying, oh, we've done our due diligence on this now, but we didn't really address the real issue there, right?
Yeah, totally. Great. So we're nearing the end of our time here. So it's even though there's still a few active questions, I'd love to just wrap up. So thank you very much, Gina, for your presentation and for your insightful comments. And